Cruise ship workers of Reddit, what was the biggest oh crap moment on the boat that luckily passengers didn't find out about at all? Story 1. I was working on a cruise not too long ago when something wild happened. It wasn't something that made it into any official reports that passengers would see, and most people on board were completely unaware of just how serious the situation was. A few cabins down from mine, there was a man and a woman, both of whom were cheating on their respective spouses. They thought a cruise was the perfect getaway. One night, they got drunk and decided to hang out on their balcony. Now, these balconies aren't exactly the safest places to be stumbling around in the dark, especially after a few too many drinks. And also in their intoxicated state, they somehow managed to fall overboard from several decks up. They were gone, slipping off the edge and into the pitch-black ocean. It wasn't until someone noticed they were missing and reported it that the crew realized what had happened. The ship had to come to a complete halt in the middle of the night. We initiated a full search and rescue operation, and for nearly an entire day, close to 18 hours, the cruise was stalled as we tried to locate them. Miraculously, they survived. The man had the presence of mind, or maybe just dumb luck, to use his jeans as a makeshift flotation device. He somehow tied off the legs and trapped air inside, turning them into a sort of emergency life preserver. It's a survival technique that's taught in some naval training programs, though I doubt he learned it that way. When they were finally rescued, both of them were in rough shape. They'd been floating out there all night, exposed to the elements, freezing, and stung by multiple jellyfish. I can't even begin to imagine how miserable and terrifying those 18 hours must have been, cold, alone in the dark ocean, unsure if anyone was even looking for you. Most of the passengers never found out what happened. They just thought we were stopped for mechanical reasons or something routine. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I work in the cruise industry, specifically providing software and services for most of the major cruise lines, so I spend a lot of time at sea. The craziest stuff tends to happen during what's called sea trials, basically when a brand new ship is being tested before passengers ever step on board. These trials are intense. They push the ship to its limits, testing engine performance, safety systems, emissions, you name it. It's not uncommon for a lot of things to go wrong during this phase. During one sea trial, I was installing a computer at a bar when a fully stocked 600-pound wine cooler came crashing down, landing face first just a foot away from me. All those bottles exploded on impact. I froze, completely shocked. A moment later, 4 security guys came sprinting around the corner. It was just me, the wreckage, and about 10 grand worth of shattered wine everywhere. I threw my hands up and slowly backed away. Turns out the shipyard workers had forgotten to bolt the cooler down, a massive protocol fail. Then there was the first voyage out of the yard, with travel agents and family guests on board. This ship was a beast, about 4,500 passengers, and 5 or 6 engines powering her. Just 3 hours into sail away, I felt a loud thud followed by huge vibrations. I was alone in an empty restaurant and saw plates and cups flying off the shelves. My first instinct was to watch the crew. If they panic, you run. But they stayed calm, so I did too, and kept working. A few hours later, another loud thud, even more intense, and then dead silence. We lost 2 engines during the first hit, and then the rest gave out. The ship had no propulsion at all. We were drifting. The passengers were only told that there'd be a delay and to enjoy free drinks. Then, about 12 hours later, in the early morning, a helicopter flew in and started dropping crates of engine parts. Soon after, power was restored. The guests had no idea how close we were to being stranded at sea, and frankly, they didn't seem to care. They just kept partying. Story 3. One time, our ship had just arrived in Whittier, Alaska, which is the cruise port for Anchorage, when a pretty unsettling incident happened. An elderly passenger collapsed and passed away right there on the gangway while disembarking. Since the incident technically happened off the ship, it created a bit of a jurisdictional conflict between the port security and our ship's medical team. Our crew wanted to jump in and try to help, especially the chief medical officer, who was ready to at least attempt CPR, but the port authorities wouldn't allow it. They insisted it was now under their control, and they didn't want the ship's staff interfering. There wasn't much hope of saving the man, but our team still felt they should have been allowed to try. Instead, the local authorities bagged the body and, since the coroner was about 6 hours out, they ended up storing the deceased in an X-ray machine storage container in the port, with local police standing guard until the coroner could make the trip from Anchorage. But man's wife decided to continue with the vacation. The full trip was one of those 14-day packages, 7 days at sea, then 7 days on a scenic rail trip up to Denali. She went on to complete the land portion of the journey. From what I heard, the cruise line fully comped her vacation, took care of all the arrangements for getting her husband's remains home, and even provided her with a personal assistant for the rest of the trip. It was a tragic situation, but I have to admit the company handled it with a lot of compassion and professionalism. Story 4. I used to work on a cruise ship, and one time after a crew party, a guy who worked the front desk jumped overboard. It was wild. The Coast Guard found him a few hours later, thankfully alive, and the whole crew was told to keep things hush-hush so the cruise could continue smoothly. Everything was under control until the captain got on the PA and straight up announced that we were delayed because a crew member jumped overboard. Rumors started flying, and for the rest of the cruise, all we got were non-stop questions from guests asking what had happened. Another time, a guy offed himself in his cabin. His whole family was on board, including a little girl. This time, the crew managed to keep it completely quiet from the passengers. I still remember seeing the family being escorted to the security office. It broke my heart. Then there was my friend who got fired for getting wasted out of his mind. When security came to deal with him, he got so mad he started peeing all over his cabin right in front of them. He spent the night in the small onboard jail and got dropped off at the next port. If someone screws up bad enough, they'll get dumped in whatever country the ship is at. No questions asked. If it's just poor job performance, they'll usually wait until the ship returns to a turnaround port. Oh, and there was this running joke among crew members. Whenever we had ice cream in the crew mess, people would whisper that it was because they needed to clear out freezer space for a body. Funny, but also not entirely untrue. Story 5. People don't realize how old some of the tech on cruise ships is. Nearly all of the onboard computer systems still run on Windows 7, including everything from engine room automation to the security systems, even the fire detection network. So when Windows decides to update and reboot, it doesn't just freeze up one system, it can take down every system on the ship at once. During those moments, we're flying blind until everything finishes rebooting. It gets worse when you consider how common physical issues are. Things like holes in the hull are surprisingly normal, especially on older ships, but they're usually small and easily patched. Fires are also not rare. The scariest one I ever experienced was a crankcase explosion in the engine room. But honestly, the fire suppression systems are so fast and reliable that no one panics. To clarify, a crankcase explosion doesn't mean the engine gets blown apart. It's more like a blast of built-up oil mist that ignites and forces itself out through the designated safety doors. The suppression system takes care of it almost immediately. The joke among the crew is that if it ever happened during a Windows update, the real danger wouldn't be the explosion. It'd be that we wouldn't even know which sensors or sprinklers had activated. Now, to be fair, the engine's core controls, like fuel regulation and speed, are all mechanical and pneumatic, so the engine can still physically run, but all the auxiliary systems, including things like monitoring, alerts, and communication with the bridge, rely on the computers. If those go down, it's like flying a plane without instruments. You can still fly it, but it's a lot riskier. Story 6. Working on cruise ships, you start to realize just how much happens behind the scenes that passengers never find out about. Small fires, especially in the kitchens, are surprisingly common. Usually they're put out quickly by the crew, no alarms needed, no panic. Then there are deaths, and yes, they happen more often than people might think. On the more luxurious cruise lines, which attract older passengers, it's not uncommon for someone to pass away quietly in their cabin. Ironically, the times when passengers do notice are during survivable emergencies, like when someone has a heart attack and needs to be evacuated urgently, either by helicopter or tender boat. There was one cruise where a drunk guest jumped off an open deck while we were at sea. Believe it or not, he survived. From what we gathered, it wasn't a self-offing attempt. just someone who got way too drunk and made a horrible decision. Still, I can't imagine the terror of hitting that water and watching the ship sail past, knowing there's nothing but open ocean and engine turbulence behind you. We also had a norovirus outbreak on board once. Gastro outbreaks happen more than you'd think, and they're taken seriously with full-on lockdown cleaning protocols. Probably the most tragic thing I ever saw was a kid putting his eye out on a ball valve handle on one of the decks. That one spread quickly among passengers. It's hard to keep something like that quiet. The crew did everything they could, but it was a grim reminder that accidents happen, even in places that feel like floating resorts. Honestly, when you're surrounded by thousands of people every day, it's a miracle more stuff doesn't go wrong. Story 7. I worked on a cruise ship for 3 years, and one night off the coast of Cozumel, Mexico, our officers got a surprising call from a completely different cruise line. They had spotted and rescued one of our passengers floating alone in open water, not near the shore, just out there in the middle of the ocean. Miraculously, he was alive and completely unharmed. Naturally, everyone was stunned, so the crew went back and pulled up the security footage. Turns out, sometime in the middle of the night, the guy had been partying alone on deck 5, visibly drunk, dancing to music from his phone. At one point, he climbed up onto one of the lifeboats, placed his phone down, and then took a running leap straight into the ocean. No push, no stumble, just jumped, and thanks to how loose his body was from being drunk, he didn't get hurt when he hit the water. He also had booked a separate room from his family, so no one even realized he was missing. The other cruise ship happened to spot him and managed to fish him out of the sea. Later, he told the news that a rogue wave had tossed him overboard. He was on deck 5, so that would have meant the wave was over 40 feet high. Not likely. Everyone on our ship was buzzing about it for weeks before it even made the news. Some folks wondered whether it had been a self-offing attempt, but from what I heard through the security and crew members who saw the footage, he looked like he was just wasted and having a good time. He was screaming for help when they found him. So who knows? Only he truly knows what went through his mind that night. Story 8. Everyone eventually found out about this, but on a QM2 transatlantic cruise, a kitchen staff member got drunk one night and jumped overboard into the North Atlantic. The ship only realized what happened the next morning when the first mate kept calling for him over the intercom, and he never showed. Later that day, the captain made an announcement and said we were turning back to search for him, with help from 3 nearby merchant ships. It was foggy and visibility was terrible, but nearly everyone stood by the railings with binoculars, trying to help. Even a wedding on board came to a halt. The entire wedding party joined the search once we entered the area. After nothing turned up, the concierge desk set up a donation box with support for multiple currencies to send money to the man's family in Chile. There were still 4 days left in the trip, and each day that box was filled to the brim. I thought it was incredible. Many companies would never allow something like that, but they did, and it was both wholesome and moving. The atmosphere was completely silent, except for the foghorn. They even stopped playing music, so there was a better chance of hearing anything. It was a dark time, but also incredibly heartwarming to see so many people come together. Story 9. I was a passenger on the Costa Serena in January 2012, just cruising the Mediterranean. One morning, all the crew and waitstaff at breakfast looked deeply shaken. Out of nowhere, we were told to do an extra lifeboat drill, which confused everyone. Later that day, we found out our sister ship, the Costa Concordia, had sunk the night before, though details were scarce. My now wife wasn't on the trip and didn't know exactly which ship I was on. She heard about the sinking before I did and was understandably terrified until I finally got access to the ship's internet-connected computer and reassured her. A lot of the crew were depressed because they had family working on the Concordia and didn't know if they were okay. It took a few days, but things slowly returned to normal. Story 10. I work on cargo ships, but during my training, I had the chance to work with cruise ship workers. One thing I've noticed from the stories I've heard is that the media doesn't pick up on incidents on ships unless it's something major involving a lot of people. Typically, the only cruise ship accidents that make the news are huge, high-profile ones like the Costa Concordia. Thankfully, those kinds of accidents have become pretty rare these days. What people don't often realize is that cruise ships have a lot of internal protocols to avoid alarming passengers when something goes wrong. If someone dies or gets seriously hurt, which happens more often than you'd think, especially with heart attacks, since at sea, getting medical help in time can be a real challenge, the crew will use specific codes when they need to call for help. They'll announce things over the tonneau system in a coded way so that the passengers don't get worried or understand the true gravity of the situation. It's a lot less stressful for everyone involved that way. Another thing I've learned from my cruise ship worker friends is that certain cruise lines, particularly those that cater to an older demographic, have a separate fridge on board just for storing bodies. Sounds a bit grim, but it's honestly not all that uncommon to have a death on board, especially with the older crowd. I've heard that going through a trip without a death is pretty rare on these types of cruises. It's just part of the reality of working on these ships, and they've got procedures in place to deal with it quietly and efficiently, making sure passengers don't even realize what's going on. In my experience, the way these things are handled is just one of the reasons why cruise workers have to stay calm and collected no matter what happens. Story 11. My dad has been working on cruise ships for over 30 years, so I've always been somewhat familiar with the realities of life at sea. But one incident that stuck with me happened back around 2008 during a specific cruise. There was a man on board who had spent his entire life as a sailor. Sadly, he had decided he wanted his last place to be at sea, so he stopped taking his medication. It's a tragic story. He had a small heart attack in the cafeteria but managed to recover and seemed to be okay afterward. That night he danced with his family, enjoying the last few hours of his life. The next morning, though, he passed away unexpectedly. It was a tough situation for everyone on board, especially for his family. His body had to be kept in the ship's freezer until the next stop in Greece. When they arrived there, his family disembarked and headed back to Hungary for his funeral. The rest of the passengers were told that the man had to leave the ship early due to a health issue, which is the kind of thing that's often shared to maintain some level of privacy and avoid causing a scene. But the truth of it, of course, was that he passed away, and it was a very emotional moment for everyone involved. The strange part, though, is that the man's family still comes back to the ship every year in remembrance of him. It's a somber yet beautiful way of honoring his memory. Story 12. I work on a cruise ship, and here are a few things you don't know. We have more fun than the guests. Sure, we work the big white hot party that you're all going to, but once our shift is over, all hell breaks loose in the crew bar. Just below and to the sides of where you're sleeping, crew members are sleeping together, smoking and drinking. Our beers are only $1. No drugs or spirits allowed, though. Also, we don't want you to know that all those funny jokes we tell you at bingo. Yeah, the same ones are said every single cruise. That really funny answer you gave us about your wife during the happy couples game. We've heard it. It was said last cruise, and the one before that, and the one before that. We are not allowed to hook up with passengers, but we do know all the little nooks and crannies the cameras don't reach. There are morgues below the deck and a jail cell. We get at least 3 deaths on board a month. Some people come on a cruise just to make their way to the heaven, and no, I do not know where Jack and Rose are. They're not real people. Story 13. A passenger went missing once, and nobody could find him for a couple of days. It turned out he had offed himself in his room, so everyone had been breathing in dead guy air for a while. We kept that one under wraps. That's the only thing the crew kept secret. But I've got some crazy and funny stories about working on ships. I was a musician, and one time, a guest entertainer, a fly-on-the-wall act, who joins the ship for one cruise to perform a single show, thinking he was Freddie Mercury. He threw his digipack CDs like ninja stars into a completely dark theater. One of them ended up clocking an old woman half an inch below the eye, and she had to go to medical. Her husband wrote a very threatening letter to the cruise director, basically saying, "My wife almost went blind, so I strongly suggest you give us a free steak dinner." I would usually be hungover, so I'd drink during the day to get over it. I'd go out in port, get smashed, and then come back. On turnaround days when a new group of passengers arrives, we have to take attendance and do a life jacket demonstration. I was so drunk one time, I threw up in the stairwell as passengers were coming in. Somehow I didn't get fired or even reprimanded, even though everything I puked up was straight liquid and smelled like booze. We all have small cabins close to each other. We usually keep a spare key under our nameplates in case we lock ourselves out by accident. One night, I woke up to find a fellow musician shirtless pissing into my wastebasket in the corner. He was so drunk he thought my cabin was his, got the key from behind the nameplate, and just decided to piss into the closest hole. Story 14. I worked on a small cruise ship, one with a passenger range of 50 to 200, running through the South Alaskan waters. Our ship's chief mate had just left for another job, and we got a new guy who had come from running cruise ships to the oil rigs in the Gulf. This was the first night with the new chief mate, who was supposedly a highly qualified captain. It was late, around 1:03 a.m., and mid-fall with an overcast sky. There were 2 deckhands on the night shift, and we stood watch on the bridge every other hour. Most of the time we just looked out the window with binoculars. We weren't allowed to do much else. We could monitor the instruments, but the bridge was small and we were mostly stuck on the left side with one radar screen and spotlight controls for the small spotlight. The chart, the big radar, AIS, GPS, and chart plotter were all on the other side, where the watch officer was. We were lookouts, a second set of eyes, but had nothing to do with the navigation or control of the ship. We were cruising through an area with a few small islands and a few larger ones. I was on bridge watch, but it was near the end of my shift, and I had just been relieved. Luckily, I still had my night vision and was hanging out on the bridge chatting with my relief and this new chief mate. That's when I saw what looked like a shadow on the water, extending left from an island. Something about it didn't seem right, so I did something a little out of character for our role as deckhands. I jumped over to the big spotlight and flicked it on. Just a few boat lengths in front of us, we saw a rock and gravel shoal. It was low tide, and this long shoal was right in front of us. The new chief mate cranked the wheel hard, and luckily, we missed it. The boat rocked a bit, and we all just stood there in shock. It was a close call. Thank God it was the last hour that the new chief mate was on watch, and thank God I was relieved from bridge watch. An hour later, after my safety rounds, laundry, and engine room checks, I returned to the bridge at the same time our longtime first mate was coming on watch. The new chief mate left, and my partner and I started telling the story of what had just happened. He was only on watch for 2 hours before the captain came on, and he told us to report what had happened. So 2 hours later, we were on the bridge again telling the captain. The next day, thankfully, was a port day. The captain asked my partner and me to write down what happened, and then we could go on shore leave. But then came the problem. Now the chief mate would know we'd tattled to the captain, and he could, from experience, make our lives hell. So we went on shore leave, had fun for an hour or two, and came back to the boat, dreading our next watch with this guy. Turns out, though, the new guy was gone, and a replacement would meet us via seaplane the next day. He was fired that day and sent packing. It turns out all he'd been doing all night was following the GPS plots. Those are just guides, not actual tracks to follow without using the radar, charts, and other navigation aids. This guy was just following a line and doing no proper navigation at all. He wasn't even marking the chart or logbook correctly. He was just copying what the GPS said. That's all he'd ever done in the Gulf, just follow a line, but in tight, confined waters like Alaska, that wasn't going to cut it. What's odd is that the captain wasn't on watch with the new guy. He just let him take the watch without any training. That's unusual because he wouldn't even let the old, experienced first mate dock by himself. My partner and I received safety awards later that year, but we were asked not to tell anyone why. It wasn't until the end of the season that we told the rest of the crew. It would have been a very different night if I hadn't seen that shoal. Sometimes I think about how many things could have gone wrong. What if I had just left the bridge instead of staying to chat? My partner didn't have night vision, so he wouldn't have seen it. What if my relief had shown up late or early? What if the conversation had gone differently? What if I had thought that shadow was just from the trees on the island and hadn't flicked on the light? Would it have been just a collision with a soft sandbar and some paperwork, or would we have hit hard rock, torn the bottom open, and drowned most of the crew sleeping in their underwater rooms? So many little things, and any one of them could have made a huge difference. Story 15. I haven't worked on a cruise ship, but I did go on a Disney cruise in February. We knew this happened since I can tell the story. Just as an aside, the cruise was amazing. Even though Disney cruises are more expensive, ours was entirely covered with rewards points, The ship never had lines for anything, and the staff was beyond incredible. Anyway, a small electrical fire broke out in a cabin down the hall from us. It's jarring to be woken up on a cruise by a general alarm, only to open the cabin door and see a crewman sprinting down the hall with a fire extinguisher. The ship's captain quickly walked past, with a couple of officers flanking him. A few minutes later, they had a crew stationed throughout the ship's halls, explaining to everyone what had happened and reassuring us that everything was fine. The family that had been in the cabin was moved elsewhere, and at the next port, it seemed like they brought in extra people to clean the floor and remove the mild smell. Fires on ships are scary, and the response is always immediate and probably proportionally larger than needed. My father was a firefighter on his cruiser when he was in the Navy, and he had similar stories. Ships don't mess around when it comes to fire safety. Story 16. I work as a contractor on cruise ships, jumping between ships throughout the year. I've done 18 cruises in the last year, and being a contractor, I get a lot of interaction with both guests and crew. The crew is trained for virtually every possible situation you can imagine, and we have required drills every week. There's quite a bit of death on board, and most ships I work on have a morgue. A lot of self-offings happen, and nobody catches it until someone reports them missing. Then you hear they jumped in the middle of the night. I've been on board when we had more deaths than we had room for, so they threw a surprise ice cream party for the crew to make room in a separate freezer. But the craziest experience for me was when we lost the satellite the night of the last election. When everyone woke up, we got it back, and the results were just in. I've never seen a more divided ship among guests. Arguments, parties, fistfights. It was 8 a.m., where we were at the time, and it's a weird way to start a day at sea. We also had a guest get stuck on a mountain in Alaska, and we had to call in air support before we could leave to get them back. And my favorite story to tell is when I was sailing the Red Sea, we had armed security on board, and they just stood and watched the water in case of pirates. We had required lights out and curtains closed after 6 p.m. for our protection, and it was always fun to see a tiny army ready to fight pirates at any given moment. Story 17. I've worked on both English and American cruise ships for 13 years, so I have some great stories, and some pretty sad ones too. The one I'm about to share didn't happen to me though. It happened to a friend who is still a cruise director today. I'll call him CD. One day, CD was strolling along a guest corridor when he came across an elderly man sitting outside his cabin on the floor. When CD asked if everything was okay, the man just looked up and shook his head. CD asked what the problem was, and the old gentleman said, "My wife is in bed. I think she has passed away." CD immediately called security, and when they entered the room, they found the man's wife had indeed passed away and couldn't be resuscitated. She was pronounced dead, and all the necessary steps were taken to handle the situation and arrange for her body to be removed the following day. The staff also made arrangements to help the man get his wife's body back home. The following day, the man told the staff he'd like to stay for the remainder of the cruise, explaining that it was what his wife would have wanted. The company allowed the body to remain in the onboard morgue until they returned to the home port a few days later. Remarkably, the man won at bingo, attended the captain's cocktail in formal dress, and was seen enjoying the rest of his cruise. Story 18. First off, on a trip from Southampton to New York, we sailed the exact path the Titanic took, and this was during the winter. We sailed through a hurricane north of Germany, and let me tell you, we were surprisingly close to tipping over. There were a few moments where machinery weighing thousands of pounds came off their moorings and slid around the ship. The quickest someone has died on board was 45 minutes. I'm not kidding. We were still in sight of Miami when someone passed away, and we had to turn around to drop off the body. As for fires, they're not uncommon on ships, especially in places like laundry rooms. It's often crew members who make dumb decisions like putting shoes in dryers or overloading them. Ironically, a lot of fires happen inside the incinerator. Here is a pro tip. Never smoke in your rooms, especially after visiting places like Mexico, where certain things might be legal. Bringing anything back with you could get you prosecuted as an international drug smuggler. Speaking of drugs, on my first tour aboard a cruise ship, a fellow crew member was found with a 5-pound brick of pot. He was immediately fired, and the pot was incinerated. He wasn't reported to any police agency, though, to avoid any bad press for the cruise line. Another thing I should mention, While crew members may be tempted to party, we're legally prohibited from having a blood alcohol content BAS A higher than 0.08% at any time while on board, whether we're working or just living there. Security can be a bit lax about it, but most people don't want to risk getting fired and kicked off the ship in a foreign country, which is exactly what happens if you get caught with a DUI. There's zero tolerance for that. And now for the most unsettling story. I was friends with the youth staff on board. Early in the week, a 12-year-old kid came up to them. But because he was 12, he couldn't join the teen group. It was an insurance thing. Despite being 6'1", he was still considered a minor for the kids group. His parents got upset, left their younger daughter, and the 12-year-old refused to join the kids' activities. Fast forward to the end of the week, the same kid was arrested for attempted kidnapping of a 30-year-old woman in SA. The youth staff I worked with were both relieved. They didn't let him join the teen group, but they were also freaking out. An uncle stayed with the younger sister while the parents stayed behind to deal with their son. It was a serious shock to everyone involved. Story 19. I once played in the show band on a ship. We were docked in Belize and were supposed to be back on board by 6 p.m. sharp because we were leaving port at 6:30. Most of the band, however, was stumbling back to the dock around 5:30, clearly drunk. That's when the music director, MD, got a call. MD picks up the phone, listens for a moment, and his face drops. It goes pale, then turns bright red. He starts pacing and says, "What the ever-loving freak, don't say a goddamn word. I'm on my way." Before anyone can ask what's going on, he takes off running out of the docking area. None of us has a clue what's happening, but we know MD is usually pretty calm. So we board the ship, go through security, and let the security team know that MD and one of our bandmates, the keyboard player KP, aren't back yet. At this point, we're mostly concerned because KP is notorious for partying hard and being a sloppy drunk. We head down to the crew bar to wait out the situation, order some more drinks, and start the countdown. 6 p.m. passes, then 6:30, then 6:40. By this point, it's strange because the ship never waits for anyone. If you're not back on time, you're on your own. But the ship doesn't depart, and we're all still waiting. Finally, at 6:45, the ship begins to leave, and that's when we see MD stroll into the crew bar. It turns out that KP had tried to buy drugs from an undercover cop in Belize. MD had to go to the police station, bail him out, and then they just walked back to the ship together. The security, hotel operations, and the passengers never got the full story about why we were late. From then on, KP had to stay on the ship every time we docked in Belize. And as a fun side note, KP paid for all of our drinks for an entire month. The band had a beer fine system in place for situations like this, and this was his way of making amends. Story 20. Heard this one from a friend who worked on the cruise ships back in the 80s. So it was one of those cruises mostly for senior citizens, and unfortunately, an older gentleman passed away while lying on one of the outdoor sunbeds. Thankfully, one of the officers noticed pretty quickly and called over 2 South American staff members whose English wasn't the best. The officer says to them, "Get rid of that quickly before anyone sees it." The officer then tracks down the gentleman's partner, and after consoling her through her grief, she asks if she can see the body. The officer takes her to the refrigerator where they keep bodies. But it's empty. He calls the ship's doctor, who knows nothing about anybody. At this point, the officer is furious and starts hunting down the 2 staff members who moved the body. When he finally finds them, he completely loses it. "Where the heck is that body?" he demands. The 2 staff members look at each other, and one finally says, "You say get rid, we get rid." The officer is now even more confused. "What are you talking about?" he asks. In response, the staff member makes a throwing over the railing motion. I wish I had asked my friend how they explained this to the wife. Story 21. Currently working on a ship sailing out of NYC, and just a few months ago, we had a pretty tragic incident. A passenger went through a breakup with his girlfriend over the phone while on board. He went to his mother's cabin, told her goodbye, and before anyone could do anything, he ran up to deck 15 and jumped about 150 feet into the water. The rescue boats searched for hours but never found his body, and everyone just assumed he got sucked under the ship and into the propulsion system. The protocol is not to tell other passengers more than they need to know in the event of an emergency, so we all had to keep quiet about it. Also on decks TT through 2, there are a bunch of watertight doors that divide the different compartments. These doors have several tons of force behind them when closing and will stop at pretty much nothing when set to close. We once had a contracted mechanic on board doing some temporary work, and he dropped a tool on the wrong side of a closing watertight door. He reached back to grab it, and his arm got stuck. The door closed on his shoulder, totally slicing off his arm. He bled out and died before anyone could find him. Story 22. We were in Greenland when things took a wild turn. Our planned voyage was supposed to include 2 more stops in Greenland, but at one of the ports, while tendering, an iceberg hit the ship. This caused a major hole, and it was in a crew cabin. They tried to stop the leak with tons of concrete. There are even pictures of this somewhere. The captain told the passengers that due to inclement weather, we would not be stopping in Greenland anymore and would head straight to Iceland. The ship set off as fast as possible toward Reykjavik, and the crew was told to maintain the bad weather story for the passengers. 20 hours later, we arrived at the port in Iceland, and that's when the underwater welder showed up. We weren't sure if he could fix it, and if he couldn't, we'd all have to go home. So of course, we spent the night partying like crazy to blow off some steam. The next day, the underwater welder had managed to fix it, and the cruise continued as scheduled. The passengers were none the wiser, and we were all left nursing hangovers from the wild night. Story 23. I went on a cruise when I was sick because I thought I was dying and wanted one last hurrah with my husband. During a meal on the ship, I ended up becoming paralyzed. The waiter was incredibly discreet, and there was an entire protocol in place to handle the situation. I don't think any of the other diners even caught on to what was happening. Everyone I interacted with remained calm and very polite, which helped keep the situation from escalating. The shipboard doctor was surprisingly good and took care of everything efficiently. It made me realize that, with so many older and sick people on these cruises, there are likely a ton of medical emergencies of all types. Probably on many cruises, the staff is well equipped and prepared to deal with them efficiently and discreetly. On another cruise, one of the excursions was a private plane scenic tour, which was a popular choice. Unfortunately, one of the planes crashed, and it took a while to learn that it was carrying passengers from another ship that was in port. That news put a damper on the rest of the cruise for everyone, though. Story 24. I used to work as a photographer on a cruise ship that held around 1,000 passengers. A few days into one of our trips to Mexico, we got word that there was a stowaway who had somehow managed to stay undetected for days before being seen. It all started when someone reported a guy acting a bit strange at a bar. Security tried to figure out who he was based on the passenger lists and photos, but he wasn't showing up anywhere. On modern ships, stowaways are pretty rare due to the heavy security measures in place. Passengers use their ID room key for all transactions, meaning you can't buy anything with cash or even get off the ship without being scanned. But somehow, this guy slipped through the cracks. It turns out he was a very good-looking younger guy who had figured out that he could blend in by finding larger groups of attractive people, mingling with them, and looking like he belonged. No one had any idea how he got on board, though the crew never got the full details from security. The guy had a pretty interesting strategy. He'd befriend single women on the cruise, let them buy him drinks, take him to dinner, and then stay with them since he didn't have a room of his own. He wasn't really after anything specific. He just wanted to see if he could pull it off. When they finally caught him, they had to give him a room because they couldn't just drop him off in Mexico illegally. And from what I heard, they ended up paying him to keep quiet about the whole thing. Story 25. I worked on ships for about 4 years and saw a lot of crazy stuff. It was embarkation day in Miami. And for those who don't know, that's when all the public areas of the ship are open, things like the theater, spa, gym, etc. So new passengers can explore and settle in, though honestly, it's mostly about trying to sell them packages. Anyway, there was this older man who was checking out the gym, dressed casually in jeans, a Hawaiian shirt, and flip-flops, and he decided to hop on the treadmill for a run. Well, he had a heart attack and died right there in the gym before the cruise had even started. Since we were still in Port Miami PD and the coroner had to come aboard to investigate, which caused a bit of a mess. The worst part was that the gym had a huge glass wall that overlooked the pool deck, so it's unclear how many passengers saw the whole thing before we could even close off the area. The crew quickly shut down the pool, and Jim, the coroner, took the body, and we ended up sailing a few hours late. No announcement was ever made to passengers about what happened. They just carried on as usual, and it was like nothing happened. Story 26. I was a passenger on a Royal Caribbean ship at the end of our cruise, docking in New Orleans. While waiting to disembark, we were hanging out in our adjoining cabins. I stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air and to watch the cargo barges drifting down the Mississippi River. As I stood there, I thought I heard a faint voice shout. At first I figured it was nothing, but then I heard it again, sounding like help. I called my friends onto the balcony to see if they could hear it too, but they didn't. I kept scanning the water and heard it again. This time I noticed something floating in the distance, some driftwood, and wondered if it could be a person. My friends assured me it was just debris. But then I saw a huge barge approaching, and fear gripped me. I rushed down the hallway, found the first room attendant I could, and told them what I thought was happening. They didn't waste any time, immediately dialing a direct line to the bridge, relaying the position I last saw the object. Moments later, the ship's sirens blared, and an announcement echoed over the PA system. Oscar port side. People were suddenly running to the side of the ship, shouting that the barge was about to run over what was now clearly a struggling person in the water. Incredibly, the barge barely missed them, and just as we were losing sight of the swimmer, a tugboat from the far side of the river came racing toward the scene. They moved faster than I ever thought possible and managed to rescue the swimmer just as he was about to disappear around the bend. Later, I learned that the person in the water had jumped from the Crescent City Connection Bridge to off himself. If you've never been on the Mississippi River, you can't fully appreciate how wide, fast, and busy it is. It's a miracle that person didn't drown or get run over. I also learned that Oscar is the universal term used for man overboard situations. Story 27. Crime on cruises is disturbingly easy due to the loopholes in maritime law, and this is a story I never thought I'd find myself a part of. Unfortunately, I didn't end up as one of those statistics, but I came dangerously close. To sum it up, I was held at gunpoint while a gang took advantage of my partner. When security found me, I was bleeding profusely from my head, with blood soaking my entire shirt. They walked me to the medical facility, and as I was trying to process what had happened, a woman and her child passed by and asked what had occurred. The security team casually brushed it off, saying it was just a nosebleed. Later, when I tried to report what happened, they denied the whole thing. They even tried to claim it was a dispute between my partner and me, conveniently leaving out the fact that a group of armed people had threatened us. When we insisted on calling the police, they told us they were the police and threatened us with a defamation suit. This was all from a major cruise line, too. It wasn't until later that I learned about the protocol for situations like this. The Coast Guard should be called immediately. After doing some research when I got home, I discovered that just before our trip, another couple had been found dead in their room on the same ship, reportedly during their honeymoon. It's chilling to think about how many people might have gone through something similar or worse, only to be ignored or silenced by the system in place to keep things running smoothly. This entire thing messed me up. We got off at the first port and flew home, but the trauma stuck with me. I couldn't sleep for a week, dealing with the effects of PTSD. Story 28. I spent about 5 months working as an ordinary seaman with NCL in Hawaii, and the job was anything but predictable. I had all sorts of responsibilities, but they changed constantly, depending on which officer felt like being in charge that day. One thing that stayed consistent, though, was the night washdown cruise routine. We'd often catch passengers doing the devil's tango in the hot tubs, usually late at night. They had no idea that everyone on the bridge, in the engine room, and security was watching them through the cameras. When I was assigned to maintain the chemical levels in the pools and hot tubs, I couldn't help but notice how often both kids and adults would release their bodily functions in them. Every time that happened, the pool would need to be shut down and cleaned, but it wasn't an instant fix. Getting the pH levels back to normal took time, and during that period, people would sometimes end up with discolored hair if they ignored the do not enter ropes just because they couldn't wait to jump in. It was frustrating because we couldn't keep the areas off limits long enough for them to get the message. Then there was the chief mate, who was an absolute nightmare. I caught him in the act of doctoring my pH level logs right before a major audit. It was shady as hell and just added to the stress of an already intense work environment. And let's not forget the countless this circulating the 1,000-strong crew. It was an ongoing issue, and I'm sure it added to the mental and physical toll of life at sea. These are just a few of the things I witnessed during my time on the ship, but they left an impression. It was a world where a lot of things stayed hidden beneath the surface, and I was just trying to keep up. Story 29. I worked at the front desk on a cruise ship, and one afternoon things got a bit chaotic. We started receiving multiple reports about a man overboard. As we were passing by a particularly scenic area, lots of passengers were out on the decks and balconies, trying to catch a glimpse of the person in the water. The ship immediately turned around, and rescue boats were dispatched to search for the individual. It didn't take long for the crew to locate the person, who turned out to be none other than the ship's safety officer. He was exhausted, but luckily he was okay. At first, everyone assumed he had jumped in after someone, so the search continued for a while. The officer was having a tough day and thought jumping into the water might help him escape his problems. But the passengers mistook his white uniform for a bathrobe and thought he was just another guest in the water. We didn't correct them, we just let them believe it. I was working the overnight shift at the front desk, when out of nowhere, the ship's emergency alarm blared through the ship at midnight. This wasn't just any alarm. It was the one that meant passengers had to report to their muster stations immediately, signaling a possible emergency. The crew decks were in chaos. I remember seeing crew members running down the halls in their underwear, trying to make it back to their cabins to grab their emergency gear. It felt like a scene straight out of a disaster movie, with some crew members even preparing lifeboats, just in case the captain gave the order to abandon ship. Meanwhile, the passengers slept soundly, completely unaware of the commotion. In the end, it turned out the whole panic was because someone on the bridge had forgotten to silence an alarm. It was supposed to be a test, but for some reason it was only set to sound in the crew areas. Why it was designed this way, I have no idea. It was a pretty ridiculous mistake, but a memorable one nonetheless. Story 30. Let me set the record straight on why I will never go on a cruise again. I was a construction worker during the recession, and after getting laid off for a while, I needed a break. So I decided to join the crew of a small cruise line. There was so much going on behind the scenes that passengers had no idea about. After some time, I'd shown enough initiative to be given the role of engine room attendant ERA. About 4 months in, the ship I was working on was sent to dry dock for regular maintenance. So they flew me out to Charleston, where I boarded a brand new ship. This one was 100 feet longer, with a whole different layout in the engine room. They had computers for the generators and engines, and I had to start from scratch learning the new system. The first mate showed me around the engine room, walked me through the basic systems, and then I went to the crew quarters to catch some rest before my shift started. But not even 10 minutes into my sleep, one of the other deckhands barged in and started shaking me awake. "The captain needs you to get to the engine room now." I was half asleep and threw on whatever clothes I could find, hauling to the engine room. As I ran in, I saw another deckhand bolting out, tossing me a walkie-talkie, and yelling, "Good luck," before disappearing. I looked outside and realized we were almost in total darkness, and the shore was only about 20 yards away. My heart dropped. I rushed down to the engine room, which was insanely hot, and red lights were flashing everywhere. I was freaked out. The captain's voice came over the radio, shouting about the engine temperature, and then I barely heard him scream, "Switch to the other mother-freaking engine." I quickly switched to the backup engine and started warming it up while trying to read the system booklets hanging by the equipment. "Change over now," came the command. At this point, I didn't question it and just shut down the first engine and switched to the other. But then things went south. The second engine died, and we were still right next to the shore, just drifting. Panic set in, and the cursing over the radio just kept getting louder. I tried restarting the engine. It went for a couple of minutes and then died again. "Did you hit the green button? Hit the green button?" The thing was, there were 16 green buttons. I had no idea which one was the right one. At this point, the first mate was down in the engine room with me, and we were both in full panic mode. It felt like we were about to run around. I could hear the anchor being dropped. The captain showed up, and now the panic was even worse. Everyone was just pushing buttons everywhere. I kept flipping through the manual and finally found something. The valve for the water that cools the engines was closed. I turned them both on, tried the engine again, and thankfully it fired up. Relief flooded over me as the ship started to stabilize. We pulled up the anchor and headed to the next port like nothing ever happened. Nobody knew how close we were to disaster. No complaints from passengers. Turns out the former ERA had been fired at the last port and was suspected of deliberately closing all the valves as a final screw you to the company. He nearly wrecked the engines and could have put a lot of people in danger. So yeah, after all that chaos, I'm never stepping foot on a cruise ship again. Story 31. I used to work as a photographer on a major cruise line. It was long hours, hard work, but a lot of fun. After a 10-14-hour day, the best way to unwind was to head up to the crew mess and grab a beer for just 10p. One night there was some Indian celebration going on, and we were partying until about 4 a.m. Around 4:15 a.m., things started to wind down, and I ended up chatting with one of the engineers. He told me a little bit about his job and mentioned that he was about to start a 12-hour shift in 30 minutes. By this point, though, the guy was completely hammered, like 8-10 drinks deep. I didn't want to mention that, but I asked a little more about what he did. He explained that he took care of the engines, but then he casually dropped something that caught my attention. Out of the 6 engines they had, only 3 were functioning. That made me a little uneasy, so I pressed him for more details. He reassured me that everything was fine, that the ship could run on just 3 engines without issue. As long as another one didn't go down, it should be okay. I was a little worried, but I shrugged it off and went to the smoking room to have a cigarette or two to clear my head. About 10 minutes into my smoke break, I saw an officer approach the engineer through the window. The officer looked urgent, and the engineer followed him out. I completely forgot about the conversation in my drunken haze, but a little while later I went up to my friend in retail and asked what had happened. That's when I found out that one of the lead engineers had come in to drag the drunk engineer away because one of the other engines had gone down. If they didn't get it up and running in the next few hours, we wouldn't be sailing in the morning. I didn't see that guy again for a while, but I heard they managed to sort it out in time. Story 32. I spent 3 years working on cruise ships, and some of the most insane stories I have revolved around the crew. There was this one guy from the sports staff who had been stalking his ex-girlfriend on board. He caught wind that he was about to be fired and taken off the ship, so instead of turning himself in, he decided to hide in a lifeboat for 3 days. There's this special safety drill called a high clearance situation that prevents the crew from leaving the ship until the issue is resolved, and the crew had to search for this guy without letting the passengers know what was going on. What's crazy is he worked his way through the lifeboat supplies actually kind of smart, when you think about it. I can't remember if he turned himself in or was found, but either way, it was a wild situation. It's a pretty high clearance deal to go down to the engine room. They raffle off an engine room tour for like $10,000 for 2 passengers, but only in very special situations, like when they're raising money for the Children's Miracle Network. But I'd been down there in my formal gown before, thanks to my roommate who was dating the engine cadet. We all got drunk on formal night and decided it would be a good idea to take a trip down there. I also used to date the chief officer of safety on a large ship. He was a first responder for medical emergencies. There was one time we were in bed when the alpha call came in, and he had to throw on his pants, which were always laid out for emergencies like that, and run upstairs to perform CPR on someone already dead, because he had to continue until the medical personnel pronounced them dead. And to top it off, he was probably drunk. There are so many similar stories from people who dated doctors, nurses, and others in medical roles. On the flip side, my roommate wouldn't date a nurse because she didn't want to be woken up in the middle of the night for a medical emergency if she was planning on staying the night with him. One ship I worked on had this really creepy hotel director. He always made me feel uneasy. I was one of the entertainers, and I was the only one who would consistently turn down his invites for champagne, dinners, etc. He took note of this and made my life miserable. A few months after I signed off, he was arrested for date raping one of the crew members. He was taken off the ship in handcuffs. He now runs a hotel in Canada. He was arrested while the ship was in port, so some of the guests had to see it happen as they were leaving or coming back. I bet that was a tough thing to explain to people. There was also a time I worked on a ship that had a fire so bad that the crew was told to go grab warm clothes, passports, and money and get ready to head to the muster stations where you go if the ship is about to sink. I remember that being one of the scariest moments of my life. We were so close to losing control of the fire, but they managed to get it under control just in time. The passengers had absolutely no idea what was going on. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.